For 70 years, the greatest minds in biblical scholarship studied these manuscripts and believed they understood them. They were wrong. Not about the texts themselves, not about the words, the languages, the religious significance. They were wrong about something more fundamental, something that no amount of reading ancient Hebrew, or analyzing handwriting styles, or debating theological content could ever have revealed. They were wrong about when the scrolls were written, wrong about where they came from, wrong about who produced them, and wrong, in the most consequential way, about what they actually represent. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the most important collection of ancient manuscripts ever discovered. Found in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd boy who threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something shatter, the sound of a clay jar breaking after 2,000 years of silence. They consist of roughly 25,000 fragments, representing approximately 1,000 different manuscripts. Biblical texts, religious hymns, community rules, apocalyptic prophecies. The oldest known copies of books that would become the Hebrew Bible, written in the centuries before and after the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, preserved in the extraordinary dryness of the Judean desert until a rock thrown by a teenager in 1947 announced their existence to the modern world. Scholars have been studying them ever since, and now, in a development that has sent genuine shockwaves through the academic world, two waves of scientific technology, ancient DNA analysis and artificial intelligence, have looked at these manuscripts from angles that traditional scholarship never considered. And what they found is rewriting the history of the Bible. The first wave arrived in 2020. The second arrived in June 2025. Together they have dismantled what scholars thought they knew and replaced it with something far more complex, far more surprising, and far more significant. To understand what these technologies revealed, you first need to understand the problem that 70 years of traditional scholarship could not solve. The scrolls, by themselves, tell you almost nothing about their own origins. They have no dates on them, no author names on most of them, no place of origin marked on any of them. They are texts, and texts alone. Ink on ancient parchment, stripped of almost every contextual clue that would normally help historians understand where and when they were produced. The method scholars relied on was called paleography, the analysis of ancient handwriting. Experts would study the shapes of individual letters, the particular way a scribe formed a Hebrew aleph or a lambd, the thickness of strokes, the angle of characters, and compare all of it against other known manuscripts from datable periods. It was exacting work, the kind of work that required decades of training and intimate familiarity with ancient scribal traditions. And it produced results: broad date ranges, style classifications, groupings of manuscripts into periods named after the Hasmonean dynasty, roughly 150 to 50 BCE, and the Herodian era, roughly 50 BCE to 70 CE. For 70 years, this paleographic framework was the primary tool for understanding when any given scroll was written. The problem was that it was inherently subjective. One expert's judgment about the age of a letter form could differ from another expert's judgment by a century. Dating controversies among paleographers were common and sometimes bitter. There were almost no firmly anchored reference points, almost no dated manuscripts against which the undated ones could be confidently compared. The entire dating system was, as one researcher put it, built on comparisons of comparisons, estimates anchored to other estimates, with very few fixed points of certainty holding the whole structure together. And underneath all of it was a contamination problem that nobody had adequately addressed. In the 1950s, when the scrolls were first being studied, conservators made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. To make the faded, darkened text more legible, they applied castor oil to the parchment surfaces. It worked. The text became more visible. But castor oil is a modern organic compound. And when radiocarbon dating was applied to the scrolls in the 1990s to provide scientific anchor points for the paleographic estimates, the castor oil had contaminated the samples. Because castor oil is younger than the ancient parchment it was painted onto, its presence in the samples dragged the radiocarbon dates toward the present, making the scrolls appear younger than they actually were. Decades of radiocarbon dating results were systematically skewed by oil applied 70 years ago to help scholars read the text. The calendar the entire field had been using was, in ways that nobody had fully reckoned with, wrong. Then, in 2025, a research team led by Professor Mladen Popovic, director of the Qumran Institute at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, published a study in the peer-reviewed journal PLOS1 that attacked the problem from two directions simultaneously. And what they found forced scholars to look at every date they had ever assigned to a Dead Sea Scroll with fresh uncertainty. First, they addressed the contamination. They took 30 scroll samples from manuscripts discovered at 4 different locations and carefully cleaned them to remove castor oil, residue before applying modern, more sensitive radiocarbon dating techniques. The cleaned results were immediate and striking. Most of the newly dated manuscripts were older than previous analyses had suggested. some substantially so. Only 2 came back younger. The systematic skewing that the castor oil had been introducing for decades was real, and correcting for it pushed the production dates of many scrolls further back into history than the old numbers had indicated. But the radiocarbon dating, however improved, still had limitations. It requires destroying a small physical sample of the manuscript. 7 milligrams of ancient parchment cut away and consumed in the analysis process. On a sacred text that is already fragmentary and irreplaceable, even 7 milligrams is a loss that carries enormous ethical and conservation weight. You cannot radiocarbon date your way through 25,000 fragments. And the date ranges it produces, while scientifically grounded, can still span decades or even a century. Ranges broad enough that they leave significant historical questions unresolved. This is where the artificial intelligence entered. Popovich's team built an AI system they named Enoch, after the biblical figure described in Jewish tradition as a man of profound wisdom and early scientific knowledge, and also the name of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. What Enoch was trained to do was something no human paleographer had ever been able to do with the same objectivity and scale. Read the geometry of handwriting itself as a temporal signal. The team fed Enoch high-resolution images of 24 manuscripts whose dates had been established through the new, cleaned radiocarbon dating. The AI studied not the meaning of the text, it did not read Hebrew, but the microscopic geometric characteristics of the letter forms themselves, the precise curvature of each stroke, the exact angles at which lines met, the proportional relationships between parts of individual characters, the subtle variations in ink, trace patterns too fine for human eyes to consciously register, features that are the product of a specific scribal hand working in a specific period, trained in a specific tradition, and producing writing that carries the temporal fingerprint of that training embedded in its geometry. Once Enoch had learned to correlate those geometric features with the radiocarbon-anchored dates, the team tested it. They presented it with 13 additional manuscripts whose dates they already knew from the new radiocarbon work, but withheld that information from the AI. Enoch correctly identified the dates of those manuscripts 85% of the time. Tachasand frequently produced narrower probable date ranges than radiocarbon dating alone could achieve. A human paleographer, working from traditional methods, might assign a manuscript to a range spanning a century or more. Enoch could narrow that to approximately 30 years. It was outperforming the traditional method on the traditional method's own ground. Then they gave Enoch the real test. 135 Dead Sea Scroll fragments that had never been radiocarbon dated, manuscripts that had existed for 2,000 years with no scientifically grounded date attached to them, known only through the subjective judgments of paleographers who disagreed with each other about when they were written. Enoch analyzed the handwriting geometry of every single one and produced date estimates for all of them. When human paleographers reviewed the AI's results, they judged 79% of them realistic. About 80% of the time, Enoch's estimates were earlier, older, than the dates human scholars had previously assigned through traditional paleographic analysis. The implications of that finding are significant enough that Popovich used the word revolutionary without apparent hesitation. If the scrolls are systematically older than scholars thought, if the Hasmonean period manuscripts that were dated to 150 to 50 BCE are actually from earlier in that range, or even before it, and if the Herodian script manuscripts thought to originate in the mid-1st century BCE actually emerged in the late 2nd century BCE, then the entire timeline of early Judaism shifts. The sophisticated religious communities and the complex theological literature they produced emerged earlier than the established framework acknowledged. The ideas encoded in these texts, ideas about messianic expectation, ritual purity, scriptural interpretation, community organization, were developing and spreading earlier than historians had understood. The roots of what would become both rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity reach back further into the past than 70 years of scholarship had placed them. But the 2 most electrifying specific findings from Enoch's analysis involve particular biblical books whose dating carries enormous historical and theological weight. The first is the Book of Daniel, a scroll fragment called 4Q Danielk. One of the Dead Sea Scroll copies of Daniel had been dated by paleographers to the early 160s BCE and confirmed in that range by previous radiocarbon dating. Enoch's analysis aligned with this date. So far, no surprise. But what the combined analysis revealed was something scholars described as extraordinary. If the Daniel fragment dates to the 160s BCE, and many scholars believe Daniel was originally composed in the Hellenistic period in approximately the 2nd century BCE, then this particular manuscript copy could date to the very period when Daniel was being written for the first time. A copy made in the author's own lifetime, potentially one of the earliest manuscripts of any biblical book ever to have existed, written when the original composition was still fresh, when the author may still have been alive. The second case is even more dramatic. A scroll fragment called 4QQ Koheleth A, a copy of the Book of Ecclesiastes, had previously been dated by paleographers to between 175 and 125 BCE. That was already old. But Enoch's analysis suggested a dramatically earlier date, between 300 and 240 BCE. The difference is not minor. It is between 50 and 100 years earlier than the previous best estimate. And Ecclesiastes is a book that scholars have long dated to the late 4th or early 3rd century BCE based on the nature of its language, its philosophical content, and its relationship to other ancient Near Eastern wisdom traditions. If Enoch's dating is correct, on the Ecclesiastes scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls collection was copied at approximately the time the book was composed, making it, like the Daniel fragment, a manuscript that may date to the era of its own author. No other biblical manuscript from this period has ever been securely dated this close to its original composition. The Dead Sea Scrolls have always been valuable as the oldest known copies of biblical texts. What Enoch's analysis suggests is that some of them may not merely be old copies. They may be original manuscripts, or copies made within years or decades of the first composition. The distance between the original writing and the surviving document may be almost nothing. This is where the 2025 AI study connects to what came before it, because the ancient DNA analysis published in 2020, which had already transformed how scholars understood the scrolls, had established the necessary context for understanding why these new dating results matter so profoundly. That earlier study, conducted by a team that included molecular biologist Oded Rachavi and biblical scholar Noah Mizrahi, had extracted ancient DNA from the animal skins the scrolls were written on. Dust particles of parchment accumulated in the storage containers, gathered without touching any written surface, and sequenced genetic material that had been sitting in the parchment for 2,000 years. What the DNA had revealed was that the scrolls were not all made in the same place. Most fragments were written on sheepskin, which made ecological sense. Sheep can survive in the arid Judean desert around Qumran where the scrolls were found, but some significant fragments were written on cowhide, and cattle cannot survive in the Judean desert, while cows need abundant water and substantial grazing land. The environmental conditions around Qumran make cattle husbandry physically impossible. Any scroll written on cowhide was produced somewhere else entirely, somewhere with water, with pasture, with the ecological resources that the desert lacks. The DNA had proved, with the certainty of biological evidence, that the scrolls came from multiple geographic origins. When the DNA analysis had also examined the two dramatically different versions of the Book of Jeremiah preserved among the scrolls, one version similar to the Hebrew Bible, as it exists today, longer, and with chapters in a familiar order, the other, significantly shorter and differently arranged, it found that the shorter version was written on cowhide and the longer version on sheepskin, different animals, different regions, different textual traditions being independently preserved and transmitted in separate communities. The differences between those two versions of Jeremiah were not scribal accidents or copying variations. They were the fingerprints of genuinely distinct textual traditions that had developed apart from each other, communities reading and preserving different versions of what was ostensibly the same scripture. Together, the DNA evidence and the AI dating analysis paint a picture of the Dead Sea Scrolls collection that is dramatically different from what 70 years of traditional scholarship had established. These are not the private library of one isolated sect, the Essenes of Qumran, copying texts for their own use in a desert monastery. They are a collection assembled from multiple communities, multiple geographic regions, multiple textual traditions, produced across a time span broader than the old dating suggested, representing the full diversity of Jewish religious life during one of the most consequential periods in human history, the period when the Hebrew Bible was taking shape, the period when different communities were making different choices about which version of a scripture to follow and which interpretation of sacred law to observe, the period when the seeds of both rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity were germinating in the rich, contested soil of Second Temple Jewish religious life. What Enoch has added to that picture is temporal precision. Where the DNA analysis proved geographic diversity, these scrolls came from different places, the AI analysis is demonstrating temporal depth. These scrolls are older than we thought. Why the traditions they represent were forming earlier than the established framework acknowledged. The sophisticated theological and literary culture visible in these manuscripts was not a product of the Hellenistic period alone. It had roots reaching back into a Persian and early Greek world that historians are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Professor Popovich described Enoch as a time machine. What he meant was that it allows scholars to situate ancient scribes in time more precisely than ever before, to say, with scientific grounding, that the hand that wrote this particular manuscript was trained in a tradition that places it in this specific generation. In this specific period of cultural and religious development, Closer in time to the original composition of the text, it was copying than anyone previously imagined. The scrolls are like a time machine, Popovich said, because they let scholars see what people were reading, writing, and thinking at the time. And now, for the first time, we are beginning to understand when the time actually was. What remains to be done is enormous. Enoch needs more training data, more firmly dated manuscripts to anchor its temporal model with greater precision. The radiocarbon cleaning and redating project needs to be extended to more of the collection, correcting the systematic errors introduced by decades of castor oil contamination. The geographic sourcing suggested by the DNA analysis needs to be refined, linking specific textual traditions to specific regions of ancient Judea with the precision that expanded genetic databases may eventually allow. The 21% of scrolls that Enoch could not realistically date, fragments with poor image quality, unusual scribal styles, or characteristics that fall outside the current training set, need to be addressed as the AI model grows more sophisticated. And 95% of the collection has still not been subjected to either ancient DNA analysis or AI handwriting study at all. The fragments analyzed so far are a sample, a large and carefully selected sample, but still a fraction of what exists. Every new fragment analyzed has the potential to reveal another piece of a picture that is only now, after 75 years of study, beginning to come into full focus. What the combination of ancient DNA and artificial intelligence has done to Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship is not simply add new tools to an established field. It has revealed that the established field was working with systematically flawed data, contaminated radiocarbon dates, subjective paleographic estimates, assumptions about origin that biological evidence has now contradicted, and it has provided objective, empirically grounded methods for replacing those flawed foundations with something more solid. The scrolls are older than we thought. They came from more places than we thought. They represent more diversity of tradition and belief than we thought. And the story they tell about how the Bible came to be, how sacred texts were composed, copied, transmitted, disputed, and eventually canonized, is richer, stranger, and more human than the simplified version that dominated scholarship for 2 generations. The shepherd boy who threw the rock in 1947 could not have imagined that the sound of breaking clay would still be echoing in scientific laboratories and university institutes across the world, more than 75 years later. He could not have imagined that an artificial intelligence would one day read the geometry of letters written 2,000 years ago and push those letters further back into history than anyone had known to look. Or he could not have imagined that the animal skins the letters were written on would contain their own testimony, genetic evidence of where they came from, preserved in the very material of the manuscript. The scrolls have been talking for 75 years. We are only now learning to hear everything they are saying.